to welcome you to the webinar today, which is material shortages and cost escalation in the built environment and what it means to you and how to identify and react. Want to first introduce our panelists for today in no particular order. Our panelist is Adam Lackey from Exponent, will be speaking today. Rob Wenger, who's a vice president with WCS Construction, will also be part of the panel. And then last but not least, Larry Prosen, who is chair of the program committee that put this program on today, organized and put this on, and he's a shareholder at Cozen O'Connor. So welcome, gentlemen, to the panel. And we'll just jump right into this to move time along here. So we start off with, we all thought this was a good quote to deal with this particular subject. Prepare for the unknown by studying how others in the past have coped with the unforeseeable and the unpredictable. And that's in some ways what this situation has been to an extent through the period of time over the last almost 2 years at this point, with some of the issues that we're dealing with and disruption and delays and other things that we're going to talk about on the topic today. What we will cover in this program today is, well, first we'll sort of define the problem, what have been the issues, then talk about project delivery methods and how the cost model and the delivery model for that can dictate or allocate risk between the parties. And then we'll get into issues about allocating risk in the contract. And then we'll shift that to a discussion about managing risk from the project and the team side of the equation, and have a discussion about that. We will have, our intent is to have time for question and answer at the end of the discussion by the panelists here today. So there should be plenty of time for question and answer. So, the disruption has the industry has been disrupted by COVID, and then things has sort of expanded and continued to evolve over time to where now we're seeing major issues like supply chain issues. And now we're seeing also cost escalation that's been going on. And it brings more so to the need for proper planning and thought on managing risk and how to deal with that. And as we've seen in the industry news, that it looks like this is not over. We're going to continue to experience this, at least to some extent, into 2022. So there's some input from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The blue line on the chart here shows the bid price between April of 2020 through November of 2021 has seen an increase in pricing of about 13%, which is in contrast to inputs for construction and essentially measured through commodities, more or less. And what that shows you is that overall, on average, there's been about a 29% increase over that same period. So there's been a significant gap growing over time if we go all the way back to early 2020 and move forward through the end of last year. The data beyond that is not quite out yet. But it gives us within the last 2 months where things have gone. And you can see that that's been an increasing gap, although it did narrow towards the end of last year. And Rob Wenger may have some comment on that as we get through the program here as we go along here. Also, recent headlines. Dr. Basu, that we've had as a speaker before on our program here, he has, he's always out there in the market and making some predictions and forecasts as an economist. And, there's been, you've seen the headlines and continuing increase in cost escalation, and supply chain issues and labor demands and labor cost increasing, material cost and other cost increasing, all of which is making it more difficult to predict and allow you to forecast in this industry and the situation that's going on. There is some hope that things will calm down. The economists and the forecasters are saying 2022 might start to calm down a bit, but it's not sure. They're not sure exactly where that may end up. So this situation that we're in right now may continue to go on for some time. Common areas of impact and risk that we've seen so far and probably will continue to see. Obviously, the supply chain and the market volatility has been a big issue for everyone. There's also been, as a result of that, there's been project delays and disruption costs. COVID was a disruption cost. Has been a disruption cost as well, a delay. Payment impacts have also been out there, some legislative and regulatory issues. Labor has been affected by this COVID situation and continues to be impacted by that. We see projects that are continuing to incur labor shortages as a result of these impacts. And then also on the supply side, the industries where labor is a big component of that manufacturing, they're seeing the same thing. I heard a story this morning about a supplier for certain materials that is now being impacted as a result of that. And then you have other impacts that we would typically see, like weather and other unforeseen conditions and things like that are going to occur over time that we're experiencing in addition to these things that have become more relevant in the last 20 months or so. So Adam, I'm going to let the panelists get started here a little bit. Want to give you a chance to speak to this issue about the contract, the project delivery method or contract model that might be used and how you can address risk with that.
Sure, and thanks, Bob. And just to kind of touch back on the last slide with the common areas of risk and impacts, those can be at both the project level directly or tangentially related to the project. Like you mentioned, the material suppliers, if they're impacted through labor shortages and things like that, can directly impact the project, even though they're not directly at the project site. So it's just some additional things to keep in mind. Moving in, so I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the delivery methods, the project delivery methods, just kind of give an overview. I think most everybody probably is familiar with this already, but I'll talk a little bit about the risk and how it's associated with these. And then I'll kind of pass it off to Larry to talk about some of the more specific language regarding the risk in these contract types. So the first one is design, bid, build, the typical method that you see out there. Stipulated sum, also known as lump sum, or GMP, guaranteed maximum price. And so this really kind of puts a medium amount of risk on the owner and kind of medium amount of risk on the contractor. I would say that maybe even a little bit more risk on the owner than this one, because the design for the project is already out there. The materials and the materials and finishes and things like that are already specified or at least provided in the specs to choose from a few different suppliers. So if there's impacts on getting those materials, supply chain impacts with that, then it's kind of more on the owner and design side to deal with that kind of thing. CM at risk, with or without guaranteed maximum price. So CM at risk is really basically the typical general contractor owner relationship. That again it can be used typically it's used with the design, bid, build, delivery strategy. So kind of duplicative with the first one that we talked about. The other option is a CM agency, construction manager agency, where the construction manager works for the owner, doesn't really hold any risk. All the risk is allocated between the owner and the contractor. The CM agent chooses the contractor for the project. And so they kind of help the owner mitigate their own risk and kind of push some of that onto the contractor where it's applicable. And then the design build, there's generally going to be more risk associated with the contractor and the designer because they'll be in their own kind of house silo on that side, and the owner is kind of a little bit more separated from it. Now they'll propose kind of an overall design, an overall strategy for the project, and they're going to hold most of the risk because they're holding the design and the construction aspect of it. To kind of touch on the allowances and contingency, these are both some methods to kind of help allocate, or not allocate the risk, to help mitigate some of the potential risks with the project by setting aside some buckets of money to be able to use for some uncertainty on the project, be it material issues or labor issues or just even selection of finishes and that type of thing. Two other delivery methods that are not listed on this slide are going to be multiple prime, which has the greatest risk to the owner because they're kind of farming it out to multiple prime contractors, which might be a separate electrical contractor, a separate structural contractor, and basically the owner is kind of acting like a general contractor in that sense. The other would be a P3, a public-private partnership, where that's going to be the least amount of risk on the owner because a lot of that's going to be by the public entity. So I'm going to pass it off to Larry now. He'll discuss some of the more specific language within these types of contracts.
Okay. Thanks, Adam. Any Rob or Larry, do you guys have any comments on that? Want to just move on to the next slide? Okay.
So I'm Larry Prosen. I'm an attorney partner with Cozen O'Connor, and for the last 25, 26 years, I've been doing construction law. We've certainly seen instances of material escalation and labor escalation before, but I think everyone can fairly say that at least in our lifetime, certainly in my career, I've not seen a situation quite like COVID, and it's having both prior impacts, particularly I would say in the first 3 months, from March 2020 through probably June or July, I probably spent 90% of my time talking to clients about how to deal with PPF and what do we do on a job site. I had one client who was working on a job site in New York that had a combination of a metro or subway station plus renovation of a building, and the building was stopped because it was privately held, but the subway continued. And how do we figure out how to deal with that, the impacts associated with that? And then how do we deal with the labor impacts and the loss of productivity that they were experiencing, having to work 6 feet apart with masks and gloves and so forth and so on. And at the time, it was such a new concept that frankly, we were generally having a lot of pretty favorable reactions from owners who were dealing with these things. Money was cheap. It still is relatively, although we're starting to see inflation and interest rates start to creep up. So there was a lot of flexibility. A lot of my practice also is government contracting. I've done work all around the world that deals with U.S. embassies and military bases. And, after this came up, we started dealing with a lot of issues, particularly in overseas jobs where governments were not shutting everything down. They were allowing certain projects to continue forward, but because it was a U.S. government project, the contracting officers were electing to shut down the job. And how do you deal with that? Now, under most contracts, you have the force. Everyone's heard force majeure, and I'll be willing to bet if you didn't know what force majeure was 2.5 years ago, I can be willing to get you that you've learned a little bit of French, and force majeure is now part of your everyday language. Force majeure has been around for ages. It's certainly been around since I came out of law school, certainly well before then. And force majeure traditionally was looked at as an event like an earthquake, or there was a forest fire or something like that. Again, in our lives, there really wasn't an instance of an international worldwide pandemic like this, but it was contemplated by that. It's sort of an act of God, and as a result, the general sort of common law case law allocation is that neither party's at fault, and therefore the contractor or subcontractor would get a non-compensable time extension. Well, that's all fine and dandy for that element of it, but you also have all the material and labor escalation. We've seen huge problems. We're obviously on the East Coast. Getting equipment from Asia or material from Asia has been an absolute nightmare. Getting it into Longport, getting into Los Angeles ports. I've spent countless hours trying to, and I don't do logistics that much, but helping clients out try to figure out how to redirect a container sitting in the middle of the Pacific through the Panama Canal to an Atlantic port, which has capacity to bring in the ship. And the costs that are associated with that and the delays associated with that can be astronomical. Likewise, the material costs associated with that, getting stuff in, raw materials and the like, has been a problem. The economy has helped mitigate that a little bit. The change in presidency will wait to be seen, although I am curious to see how the executive order from Friday that came out mandating PLAs on all federal projects over $35 million, or requiring it as a sort of de facto scenario, how that's going to impact the ability to get work done and to get labor. And we heard Bob talking earlier before about labor being, shortages and the like happening. So how do you deal with this? I'll preface my next few comments by saying it's extremely fact intensive from a contractor and subcontractor perspective. If you can move it out of a force majeure scenario into a non-force majeure situation, that's always a good thing. Make it a delay or a change as opposed to a force majeure, particularly if you're looking for compensation associated with the delay. So you look at different things. You've got standard form agreements. Everyone knows the AIA documents. Everyone knows, or a lot of people know, the consensus documents. Obviously, the federal government, for those of you who do government contracting, has the FAR provisions, Federal Acquisition Regulation provisions. And, basically there's an allocation that has to happen. And what we've seen is any number of clauses. And I'll be frank with you, most commercial agreements, at least up until COVID, did not, in my experience, did not have what we would call material risk allocation or material escalation or labor escalation provisions in them. FAR actually does have one, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but it's extremely limited. So what we would look at is putting a provision in your contracts going forward that has some sort of a cost-based trigger. Bob had talked earlier about different commodities, steel, insulation, wood products, or whatever it is that you do, whether you're a prime or a sub, and having some sort of a trigger, perhaps a cushion, if you will, that we'll buy the first 2 or 3% of risk. If it goes above 5%, then the owner agrees to pay us the delta over and above that, or the complete delta, whatever the case is. If I've got a unit price contract, let's say I'm doing concrete and I'm getting paid by the cubic foot or cubic yard. If my price goes above 5% or 10% or 15%, the owner agrees to remit payment for us on that side. And what that does is it allows you to reduce your cost on as a contractor's cost on the front end. And in other words, you don't have to build in an extra cushion into your price. And the owner then doesn't have to pay that price up front, and instead will pay it if and when as necessary. You have index-based triggers, again, dealing with commodities. A lot of the things that we work in, steel, again, wood or whatever, they float, they go up and down on a daily basis. And depending upon how those things move. And by the way, these clauses can move both upwards and downwards. So if on the day you bid the project, whatever your commodity is $100 per unit, and it goes up by $50, so $150, and the owner pays you $50. But if your unit price goes down over the course of the project, particularly a longer duration project, you can reduce your price down by that same amount of price and kind of go from there. Next slide, please.
Okay.
You also have to be prepared on a lot of these cases, and a lot of these work great in GMP, where you have an open book situation where you're showing what your actual prices The next type of clause is a delay escalation clause, which is more time-based, right? That my prices are good from now for the next 3 months, 6 months, or whatever. But if the project's delayed or whatever the case is, something happens that impacts us, we then make it effectively a delay clause, which allows us to recover escalation. So regardless of the reason, whether it's COVID, labor shortages, there's just a general delay in the project, a redesign, or whatever the case may be, the clause recognizes that there's going to be some degree of uncertainty, and that while the parties will attempt to mitigate that, there's an allocation as to the responsibility. And again, typically these are reciprocal. If the cost goes up, I as a GC or a sub get paid more. If the cost goes down, I pay less. And ironically, I did a similar seminar for this a few months ago, and on the panel were a couple of general contractor in-house counsel. And on larger industrial projects, the client was either A, taking over for certain subcontractors, bringing in-house certain prefab and the like to control costs and to be able to buy, all the quantities, for example, of piping for a job up front, so they knew exactly what their cost was. Others were actually sending people out to fabrication shops to observe the work as structural steel in that case was getting put together. And they actually had a person on site trying to work in real time to mitigate the cost and the risk allocation of this. And thirdly, one of them was even basically acting as a bank for the subcontractor, paying upfront with the owner's approval for the structural steel and other components that were upfront, so that they could buy as the market was increasing, they could buy today at say $100 and not in 2 weeks at $110. So we've seen that in a few instances. We've had a number of owners who have inquired to try to reduce their risk allocation by doing that. Next slide, please. So I mentioned before the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, and as those of you who do government contracts know, and those of you who don't, I'll tell you, there's very little negotiation on federal government contracts, certainly at the prime contract level. The clauses have the force and effect of law. The clauses, almost all of them, are directly in the FAR, which are the federal, again, acquisition regulations. So they have a limited ability to control anything. Now, in the FAR, at FAR Part 16.203, is what's called the Economic Price Adjustment Clause. And what that clause says, and by the way, you should check, it's not what's called a mandatory clause. Particularly in this environment, you should make sure that it's in solicitation documents, and if not, ask that it be added. It gives some limited ability to recover. And what it says is that if there is an increase in material costs or labor costs, the first 3% over and above what you bid or proposed, you buy the first 3%. And then it says the next 7%, so from 3 to 10%, the government will be willing to pay. Now, anything over 10%, you're going to be carrying the cost of, or you'll have to submit a request for equitable adjustment or a claim, depending on the reason. And that's another hard thing that you need to be aware of. These are very fact specific, and having a good record system, and I'm sure that Adam and Bob, who do consulting and claims work all the time, having good documents is key to being able to deal with this. So it's not only an upfront contract allocation of risk, but it's on the back end too. Other forms of agreement, like the consensus docs 200.1 amendment, has a similar sort of deal where you actually identify your key materials. Again, drywall, framing, insulation, pipe, cables or wires or switchgear, whatever. It agrees upon a baseline price as of the date of contracting, and you can use anything, whether it's market, catalog pricing or whatever. And then from that baseline, there's an equitable adjustment that would be made down the line. So again, the costs and the risks are sort of allocated up front. You know what you're going to get. The owner doesn't have to pay an extra contingency up front in order to deal with that, and you adjust it down the line. In contrast, the AIA forms don't have something like that baked in. They don't have a material escalation clause. At best, you have to go through the changes provisions and go as you would with a change and then a claim. So again, to the extent you can add language to your subcontracts up front or your prime contracts up front, it's key. Next slide, please. We talked about force majeure already. Again, they're contract based. There is a common law element, by the way. If your contract doesn't have something in there, then the common law, the decisional laws, as some people recognize it, court decisions, will also, state to the effect of that if the court or if the trier of fact or if the parties can agree that the cause in question that caused the delays, that caused the material escalation, that caused the labor escalation, or whatever else it is, was beyond the control of the parties, and that's both parties. So whether it's the owner and the GC and the subcontractor, whatever the case was, and that as a result of that that impact, which was an excuse whether there's a cost impact or by extension a schedule impact, typically you'd be entitled to a no cost time extension, and the parties carry their respective financial losses. Again, that's sort of the de facto, and that's what we're seeing in the beginning. For example, the U.S. government said we're going to try to work with our contractors. The DoD, Department of Defense, went so far as to issue a memorandum to their contracting officers saying that they should attempt to work to mitigate losses to general contractors at the discretion of the contracting officer. Now, we've had some contracting officers at that time that did a great job and said, yeah, we'll give you a change order. We've had others that say, in my discretion, I don't think this is the reason, or I don't agree, I'm not going to give you, and then you have to go through the claims process. So, and the same thing has happened in private and commercial realms as well, although I generally experience in the commercial side, things tend to be a little more reasonable and fair, as long as the owners, whatever their contingency that's sort of in their budget, is not exceeded. Again, money's relatively cheap. COVID impacts is a whole different issue because, and we've had a little debate amongst our group here. Certainly at the beginning of COVID, I think that could have been potentially either a short-term or a long-term, depending on how you look at it, impact. But now that we're almost 2 years into it, the debate goes on. Is it foreseeable? Is it not? I've had clients call me up, said, hey, I'm really getting hammered on this job. I need to put in a claim for material and labor escalation. And you look at the job, and some of these projects, they were doing the work when COVID hit. COVID was, at least for a short-term, force majeure, but the owner shut the job down instead of a month or two for 6 or 8 or 10 months. And then we're saying that's an owner-caused delay. I have another project right now that's on appeal right now, where the project was supposed to be done before COVID ever hit. There was 14 to 16 months of delay in the job. So we got pushed from a non-COVID period into a COVID period. And but for the owner's delays, we're arguing, we wouldn't have had incurred these costs. So therefore they're responsible as not a force majeure event, but as a typical sort of delay event, as we see that. So from those perspectives, it really comes down to how you document and look at the file, and how your contract says. On a going forward basis, we are starting to see tons of clauses describing COVID as either a force majeure event or not a force majeure event, depending on who's drafting the agreement and who's reviewing it and editing it. So again, knowing or potentially knowing that we're going to be dealing with COVID for the foreseeable future, certainly, they say next couple of years, being prepared and trying to allocate risk going forward on that is really critical. And hopefully having an owner or GC, depending on who you're at, who's willing to cooperate with you on that, should make that easier. Next clause, please. Another area, and again, trying to move out these impacts from a traditional force majeure is always helpful. We've used change in law provisions where the shutdown, we could have kept working, but for shutdown or whatever the case may be is they've made the Buy American Act even more strict under the current administration. As I mentioned, you've got these requirements for PLAs. How is that going to impact you, and how is that going to delay procurements, which otherwise might not be delayed as a result of COVID or whatever the case is? And then the last clause that you'd have to certainly consider is no damage for delay clauses, and well, not the last, but certainly one of the next clauses, and how that impacts your ability to seek recovery. They don't generally exist too much on federal and state government contract projects, depending on where you're doing work. Certainly a lot of commercial agreements have that. And depending upon what caused you to be delayed, was it COVID, was it something else? Again, it's very fact intensive and case specific. Next clause, please. Having the ability under a suspension clause or including something in your contract that allows the parties to suspend the work if prices spike up or if there's some sort of COVID-related delay or impact is a key way to deal with this. Again, I'm not suggesting that all owners or GCs are going to agree to it, but if you're in a highly volatile market, whether it's steel and your steel's coming in from China, and we know that there's issues with shipment and getting stuff into the marketplace in the U.S., trying to include a clause along that line in your suspension clause, not just for non-payment, but for out of your control delays, perhaps even building in shutdowns or mobilizations and demobilizations is a thought. Termination for convenience clause. Generally, that gives the owner the ability, or the GC looking downwards, the ability to terminate for its convenience. But there's no reason why you couldn't add into that some sort of issue, either with price spikes or material spikes or material shortages, as being a situation where the parties can mutually agree on a termination for convenience. Perhaps the GC or the sub doesn't get paid every single thing that they're entitled to, but there's some sort of I hate to use the word quid pro quo, but that one can use in order to mitigate that and deal with it. Bob, I'll switch it back to you for now. Next.
Okay, thanks, Larry. So I'm going to switch back to the panel here and talk about delay and disruption and cost, because that's obviously that's been a big part of this. You guys have any thoughts on the strategy of trying to shift away from the force majeure situation as the basis for entitlement? Rob, any thoughts here on what one could do in order to approach an owner as a general contractor and have a discussion on these impacts that we're seeing?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of this, and a lot of the deals that we've signed that have had major impacts is, we signed them either before or right as the pandemic was getting going. And honestly, I think, I hear a lot of talk about, well, they just say it's COVID or it's a pandemic or it's force majeure, and that's really not the case. We touched on it earlier about the weather and the shutdowns of the severe weather in the South. I think just and we'll get to it on the next couple slides, but the open, honest, and timely communication and showing the backup to the owner as to what's going on and what the options are.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Larry, when you were discussing that FAR clause with the 3% to 10% and where it exceeded the 10% increase or escalation there, I had a thought as to whether you could, if the facts fit the story, could potentially maybe make the argument that, well, it was a delay caused the escalation to occur and provide an opportunity to get the relief above the 10% escalation. Is that a potential approach that one could take?
It's not potential. We've actually done it. So just by way of a quick example, we had an embassy project in Europe. I'm not going to say where. And the project, over there, the embassy itself is, quote, U.S. territory, but the city where this was located, they allowed construction to continue forward unabated. So we were, and by the way, the U.S. government itself did not shut down any of its projects overseas, except in certain locations like China. But here, there was no directive from the agency that said, hey, we're shutting down all projects in this region. The CO just elected to shut it down, this contracting officer. And we sent a letter and we documented it and we said, we're ready to continue working. We've got American citizens over here. Our general conditions per day were almost $20,000 a day because we could only have US citizens there. And we said, look, if we shut down, we're going to seek recovery for a claim. And at the time, we were not sure if there was going to be traditional material escalation, but we did include in there any labor and material escalation because the duration of the shutdown was unknown. We couldn't figure it out. So we included that in there. We were actually getting calls from the embassy staff saying, where are you guys? We want you to continue working, and including the ambassador. And we're saying, well, we were shut down by the contracting officer. You guys go work it out with them. And we've got a sizable crew sitting down, basically playing poker in their apartments every day, waiting to come back to the job site. And ultimately, yeah, we managed, what we did was we said, fine, maybe for a couple weeks, this might have been in a traditional way, a force majeure, but no, we could have continued working unabated. So this was a traditional delay claim, and it was owner caused. So therefore, the resulting labor and material escalation that we experienced was because of the delay, not because of COVID, because they didn't have a right to do it. So that was the sort of way we did. Now, I got involved early in that. We were writing, 15, 20-page letters with detailed fragnets that were showing the impacts. It was a very well documented claim, as Rob said, having the documentation to show it. Ultimately, they got, made, well, I wouldn't say made whole, but they certainly got a decent amount of recovery, including time extensions and the like. But they pointed to the material escalation clause, said, oh, we only have to pay you, 3 to 10%. And we said no, and ultimately convinced them that they were wrong on that. But again, that was the right facts with the right documentation at the right time and the right causation.
Okay. Adam, any comment on that before we move on to the next slide?
I'll just kind of not necessarily reiterate, but maybe tack on to the comments about proper documentation and just being open and honest and documenting everything as detailed as possible, so you don't leave anything open to interpretation down the road. You have specific reasons why these impacts have happened and the specific things that have been impacted by it, so that, again, down the road, it's easy to recreate everything if you get into a claim situation and you're not leaving things open to interpretation.
Okay, great.
Hey, Bob,
Right, well,
we have one question that was posted a little bit.
okay, Steve,
Go ahead and read it, and we can pose that to the panel right now. Could strict domestic sourcing reduce the supply chain struggles? Is there too much reliance on foreign supply?
I was talking before about my clients the panel members I was with in this other panel, and they were taking on a lot of that responsibility. The answer is definitely yes. One of them was even looking into buying a smelting operation. They do a lot of large industrial, and there's a lot of structural steel involved, and actually getting buying a steel mill. Now, we're talking, huge numbers, big petroleum type projects and the like, but the answer is yes. The problem is the cost, obviously, right? Now, if you're dealing with government contracts work under the Buy American Act, you're going to have mostly domestic. And again, particularly under the current administration, they've increased the requirement and strengthened the language in the Buy American. If you're not familiar with it, take a look at the recent changes in the regulations on Buy American Act compliance. But it's going to make things, yes. While they say over and over again, it's going to strengthen the economy, it's going to do this, I don't know if it really is, to be honest with you, because it's going to make things more difficult for all of you in a lot of ways to get what you need to do to actually make the project successful.
okay, let's move on to the next piece. So Rob, from your perspective as a general contractor, have you got some thoughts on how project teams can manage the risks that we're seeing, that we've been talking about so far? And you've probably got some other thoughts, things that you're actually experiencing yourself. You want to discuss those?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we touched on this earlier, but early, open, and honest communication as soon as you know what's going on, and that's on all sides, to owners, to subcontractors. We rely on subcontractors to tell us what they can and can't get, and just transferring that to the owner, or not transferring, but communicating that properly to the owner, so they can make an informed decision. Also, stored materials, early buyout, early storage, insurance costs. Sometimes there's extended warranty. We're pushing for that in our bids and our buys when we are dealing with subcontractors. Just I don't care what it costs, just get it and hold it so we have it ready. Use of contingencies, allowance, and alternates. That's something that, quite frankly, the owners that we've been dealing with have been pretty open to it. We do all private work. So putting, like, if you've got $1 million appliance package, call it an allowance. It's not something that they're going to need for 2 years down the road. And the model numbers aren't going to be available anyway. And they get the full benefit of, if they find something less expensive, or if they want to upgrade, that's a straight allowance with them. And then also a risk management plan. So we use a material tracking log, and those are weekly meetings that we have with not only our teams, but our subcontractors, finding out the status of materials, where they're at, when we're going to get them, so we can be ready for them.
Yeah. So Rob, are you also seeing an increased level of at least discussion about requiring or asking that owners would purchase materials in advance of the actual contract execution to try to limit the escalation that might be coming on, or maybe even a supply issue?
Yeah, and it's not, yeah, not only that, but some contractors and manufacturers are actually requiring it just to proceed with the work. There's a certain window manufacturer out of Europe that requires a deposit to even start the project, to start shop drawings. And from what I'm learning is that's kind of a European model where deposits are required up front. We haven't done any work over there, obviously, but that's kind of how they do things over there from what we understand. So just be aware of those requirements, because more and more stuff is just coming from all over the world.
Okay. Adam, do you want to comment a little further on the risk management plan?
Sure. Thanks, Bob. So risk management plan, Rob mentioned that they're using kind of some logs as their risk management plan. You can also go really in depth on risk management plan, which is what we've done on specifically one of our government contracts in the past month or so. We've kind of helped them develop this risk management plan and analysis, and basically the risk management plan is kind of the framework for identifying and managing the risks. And what you want to use it for is to identify major risks that can cause significant or major and minor risks, to be honest, that can really impact either schedule or cost on the project. And to develop a proper risk management plan using a risk register, you identify all the potential risks that you see out on the project, usually at the beginning of the project or beginning before major elements of the project kind of kick off. And you identify all the risks, and you identify potential opportunities where you could gain some time or cost back on the project through the use of alternates, maybe something like that. And you really kind of look at this holistically with in the framework of your budget or your schedule to see, and on the risks, you're going to want to apply different probabilities of the risk, whether it's the high likelihood of happening, middle likelihood, or low likelihood. Same thing with the cost. Identify the likelihood, and then quantify the impact as well. And then you can run it through, develop this risk register, run it through what's called a Monte Carlo analysis or Monte Carlo simulation. And what that does is it runs all these different factors with the probabilities and the impact levels. It runs it through the simulation for 1,000 or so times and gives you the probability of what could happen on the job, and allows you to really identify potential areas where you can mitigate these risks and kind of plan for what if scenarios if these risks do occur. Also, when you get this kind of analysis, you get this feedback out of the risk analysis. You can use that to kind of help on the owner side determine the contingencies and the allowance amounts and things like that, and really help you kind of round out your whole contract.
Okay. Get the slide to move here. Okay, Adam, do you want to also talk about how the project schedule can be useful in managing these risks?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, the project schedule is really a big part of the risk analysis process anyway. The project schedule is also going to allow you to just kind of view which activities have higher float values, meaning that they are less critical to the project in that they have more time, I guess, of uncertainty, more time that they can kind of wait before actually impacting the project. And this is helpful so that you can prioritize activities, including things like submittals and things like that. So if you have a submittal that's more critical, has a lower float value on the project, you know that that's something that you want to get in first, because maybe that is a piece of equipment with a very long lead time or coming from overseas or something like that. You know that you want to get that in and approved sooner than later so that you can get the ball rolling in that process and make sure that you get it on the site on time to install and not impact anything else. A good example of that would be like HVAC equipment, so that you can get it installed, get it tested and hooked up and started up so that you can condition your space and begin installing your finishes, things like that. So the project schedule is definitely a very helpful tool from the get-go, and proper maintenance of the schedule on a regular basis, usually a monthly basis, is also critical to managing the risk on your project.
Okay, and also too, if you, as Larry spoke about, want to assert an equitable adjustment or a claim, the schedule is going to be important to that approach if there's a delay component to it. Rob, we've talked about proper backup. Adam and you both kind of touched on that. Do you want to talk about these other items here on the slide for managing risk?
Sure, yeah. And just real quick on the proper backup. I mean, anybody that's been to a supermarket or any kind of store in the past 20 months knows what's going on, right? But you still got to have the proper backup. All right, use of substitutions. So that's something like, just be open-minded on all sides. A lot of the projects we do being apartments, they want LVT stainless steel appliances and some kind of solid surface countertops. They might not be able to get GE, but maybe we can get your Whirlpool or something, or some, knockoff other brand of countertop. Another way is to engage the owner as far as direct purchases. A lot of these major owners and developers have got national accounts, and maybe they could buy cabinets, flooring, countertops, anything like that through their national accounts. Something else that we've been focused on and communicating is commodity index. So we do internally, we have we collect certain commodities for lumber, steel, gypsum, insulation, and we publish that to a select group of people every week, along with Random Lengths lumber index.
Yeah, I think the big thing with a lot of this is I know it all ties together, but what assumptions, what pricing, what was your bid based upon? All that sort of stuff makes, if you get into the claims side of things, your job easier, the lawyer's job easier, the consultant's job easier. And frankly, again, hopefully having an owner that is understanding and is willing to work with you and cooperate with you. And again, different owners, different means, so forth and so on. I think the use of substitutions is key too. I mean, we have, particularly in commercial work, we do have owners who insist on some sort of a sole source item. I'm flying for a mediation tomorrow where it's on a nuclear power plant where the owner specified a specific roofing product. We started putting it down only to discover that the roofing product that was specified by the owner based on specifications by the manufacturer didn't meet the specification requirements. Believe it or not, they couldn't get fire resistance and UL testing. So we had to rip the roof off, and there was a resulting delay, and then COVID hit and all the impacts, and trying to convince the owner to go with another roof. And it's not like it's like Rob, you're using a refrigerator or a cooktop or something like that, where you maybe have the same parts. It's a roof, and this thing's now languished for 2 years. And having the flexibility not only to negotiate and understand it, but having the flexibility on materials, means and methods, all those sorts of things. And you can also get to the situation where the owner's interference isn't by stopping your work, but it's by saying do it differently. You weren't going to use masks, or even I was going to use a KN95 mask, and they're requiring you to use a full respirator with face shield and 2 pairs of gloves and so forth and so on. It can be really problematic. I still have projects that I'm dealing with, mostly with the government, where they're wearing, like full asbestos type Tyvek suits, just not because they're dealing with asbestos, but because the agency's insisting that, they take extraordinary, in my opinion, COVID precautions. That obviously takes time and effort. In the cold, maybe it's not as bad, but come summer, it's going to be a real problem. And we see that over and over again. And that, again, they claim COVID as the basis for it, but they're not willing to pay the additional costs. And I say that's not a COVID related issue at all. I say it's affecting and impacting our means and methods. It's affecting our productivity. So it's identifying those things up front and being able to document them on the sort of the back end of that.
Yeah, that whole dawning process and the disruption from that has to be costing, that contractor.
Well, I'm amazed. I'm getting on an airplane in a few hours. I'll be having on a KN95 mask, and I'll be closer to people than these guys are working in the field. So it's sort of amazing that we're still dealing with some of that.
Mm-hmm. To kind of tag on to that and kind of reference back to the letter F on this slide, proper backup. And kind of also harkening back to earlier in this conversation, transparency is key in this too, especially with the proper backup. I mean, if you're experiencing material escalation, as Larry had referenced earlier, provide letters from the suppliers saying that, prices are going to increase by 10% because X or Y factor, whatever the factor is, but, provide their earlier bids versus what the costs are on the invoices now, and just kind of have an open book policy, because it's only going to help you out in the long term to be able to prove that escalation and things like that.
Yeah, absenteeism is another thing. Document that, as well as what production losses you're seeing if you're a manufacturer or a contractor that has production is real key. You got to document all that, as you guys have said. So let's take a look at this, Rob. There, I think you had a few more things you wanted to talk about on managing it from the team project team perspective.
Yeah, so timely purchasing is key. A lot of the bids we get nowadays, quotes are good for 7 to 14 days. We're asked to hold prices for 3 months. So it's really not feasible. Sometimes the supplier will give you, they'll hold it for an additional 5% or something for the time you're asking. I say take it. If they'll take the risk, take it. And qualified bids on public procurements. We haven't done a lot of that. I don't know if you guys have any comments on how to deal with that.
Can't do it.
Yeah.
Qualifications almost inevitably going to make you disqualified unless there's an exception to it. And usually you have to read the RFP to see, we'll accept qualifications on item 1, 2, and 3, but usually qualified bids on a public procurement are the death knell. And
is there any room to negotiate the FAR?
No, that's part of the problem with government contracts. And even at the state level, like in Maryland, you've got the COMAR, and DC, you've got the DCMR, which is like their own regulations. Those are actually promulgated and passed like a law is effectively. So other than basically when I took government contracting 101, other than price, schedule, quantity, and quality, very little can be negotiated on that. You can't mess with the clauses. The best thing you can do is, in order to try to get around that, is when you have the opportunity pre-bid, pre-proposal to submit questions, ask all the questions you can. You then have the right to reasonably rely on the answers, right? So if they say, if you go in and say, do we need to wear extra PPE or something like that? And they say no. And then after the job starts, here, you got to put PPE on. Well, that's no longer, in my opinion, a force majeure event. That's a government directive. And I bid it based on no PPE or de minimis, a mask or a pair of gloves, whatever it is. And if they're requiring more, then you have the right to submit a change on that. I'm not promising you'll get a recovery, and I can guarantee you they'll somehow make up some, not make up, but they'll take an argument that's divergent to that, but at least you have the ability to protect yourselves there.
So guys, we've got a question from the audience. I want to interrupt and put it out here in the interest of time, because for those that might need to end up leaving at 1 o'clock, might have a hard stop. There's a question circling back to COVID-19 impacts. Owners are now taking the position that the pandemic is now a known issue. We've all heard that, and thus indicating a new procurement that they will not allow claims for additional costs that result from COVID impacts. And the question is, what strategies would you suggest, other than declining to propose on the project, as a means to mitigate or minimize the risk? So I'll open it up to you guys and let let someone comment, and we'll take it from there.
Well, I would say, don't get away from the COVID clause and just focus on material escalation and commodities and current pricing and things like that. See if you can put in a value for escalation, contingency, and say, look, we're anticipating it's going to go up, but if it goes down, you get all of the money back, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you could try that. I mean, obviously, if you've got a material escalation clause like we talked about earlier in the case of the FAR, or I have a private one, that's a great way to mitigate it. The big problem you're going to run into, right, and we've seen this, well, we've seen it forever, but particularly I'm shocked at how many bids I get involved with, or bid protests we've had, where the number that's proposed by the successful offeror is just, it's stupid low. It's just crazy low. And they're trying to get the job, as opposed to everyone being a little more reasonable. And, you building in if they're not willing to pay for it, and they say that COVID is now a known thing and that you have to take into account, then you're going to have to take it into account and include some sort of an allowance. Now, obviously, to the extent you have your systems in place and your risk management plan in place, and let's just say hypothetically you build in 10% to your price, and you don't want to having to expend those additional unforeseen things, you're going to reap the benefit of it. To me, because COVID's a known thing, I would, if I were the government, I would treat it no different than like a differing site condition, in the sense that, the differing site conditions clause came up because the government was having to pay upfront for unknowns, basically. Because they didn't have that clause, the government was paying extra money to allow the contractor to make assumptions and assume that there's going to be bad soils. And that clause came up so that the government could get a reduced risk profile in the contract. And then if they hit something down the line, then we'll pay for it then. To me, a COVID-19 type of situation would be a perfect example of it, and anything rising out of it. But that does not exist right now. But talk to your congressman maybe or something on that front. But it's very difficult there's no magic bullet here, unfortunately, for that.
Okay, Rob, you want to finish up this slide, and then I've got a couple announcements I want to make, and don't see any new questions yet. So go ahead and let's wrap up this slide, and we'll.
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit before, all these things, but purchasing in bulk, we've got a roofing contractor that has bought a bunch of a certain type of roofing material, and not that you want to go propose it on a nuclear power plant or anything like that, but for an apartment or condo or office building, it might work out just fine. We touched on invoice transparency. Just have your backup squared away. Managing deposits, early funding. The key there is no going in. There's no way you're going to sign a contract with an owner and say, oh, by the way, I need a couple $1,000,000 to, procure my windows. And then alternative and supplemental suppliers. Keep your options open. Talk to your subs and suppliers and even your contractors about what they can and can't get in a timely manner.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Hey, Bob, there's one question in the Q&A, and the question is, have there been any likely claims due to delays?
Oh, I don't see that one yet. Sorry. Okay, yeah.
It's in the chat. It's in the chat.
Oh, what was it again, Larry? Sorry.
Have there been any likely claims due to delays? I assume likely claims due to COVID-related delays is the question.
We've seen delay claims, but I can't say that we've seen likely a tag to it. I think contractors, at least our sense is, contractors have been asking for the general conditions. That's been obviously the key, and it's been a mixed situation there. We've been seeing some owners willing to pay certain parts of general conditions like staffing, but not other costs. So Adam, you may have some other comments there.
I was just going to say pretty much the same thing. I haven't seen any specific ICLE claims on delays, which for those who aren't familiar, ICLE claims are for home office overhead, which is kind of the general conditions not directly related to the project. That's related to the corporate entity as a whole, like a lot of times like accounting and estimating and marketing and things like that. So that's what ICLE claims deal with for those that aren't familiar. But no, I haven't seen any specific to that. It's all been kind of at the general conditions on the project level.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're out there, but they're very difficult to get. You basically have to be a small business, and that because of the projects, you basically, the rule is you have to be in a stop work position of unknown duration, and you can't get replacement work basically because your bonding capacity is being held up by these projects. It's certainly possible. I have not had any, but I'm sure there's some small business out there that's tried to get it, but it's quite difficult to get, generally speaking.
Okay, so I'm going to, now that we're a couple minutes past 1 o'clock, I'm going to make a couple quick announcements. One is for any attendees that are still on, we want to remind everyone that the program committee will be having a live event, evening event on March 31st, developers panel. We've got a great panel set up, and looking forward to doing that live on the evening of March 31st. More details will be out in emails that WBC will distribute, but just want to have everyone maybe mark their calendars, save that date so that you can attend. And then the other item is the program committee sent a survey last week, and we would greatly appreciate, because 3 of us on this webinar today are all members of the program committee. So we would like, for those that you can, we would encourage you to respond to the survey so that we can collect that feedback and use that as we go forward for developing, programs and the formats and other things. It's a short survey, probably takes you less than 5 minutes. And the information will be greatly appreciated so that the committee can use that going forward. So I want to thank the panelists today for their time and effort in putting this together. I'll turn it back over to Steve for any other final comments. Otherwise, I think we're good to go.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for everybody listening.
Appreciate everybody on the panel and everybody that joined us today. And just be on the lookout for future webinars that we'll be announcing.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.